Good afternoon and welcome everyone, distinguished panelists, ladies and gentlemen. A warm welcome to the Geneva Center for Security Policy and our 25th anniversary celebrations. And this outstanding panel, of course. In the next 90 minutes, we will engage in a collective brainstorming on what we believe, or rather what we would like to see UN peace operations look like in 2030. Is it steady state, adaptation, revolutionary change, or something altogether different? Before we embark on seeking to respond to this pivotal question, it is my absolute pleasure and privilege to introduce to you the host of the 25th anniversary celebrations, the GCSP Director, Ambassador Christian Dusay. Over to you.
Thank you very much, Annika. Good afternoon, good evening, or good morning. Greetings from Geneva and the Maison de la Paix, the House of Peace. Thank you very much for joining us today, wherever you are. The GCSP is an international foundation that was established in 1995 to serve a global community of individuals, organizations, and countries. It was launched at the initiative of Switzerland to contribute to peace and security worldwide. The GCSP is now a center for executive education, a platform for dialogue, and an incubator for innovative projects in the fields of peace and security. It is supported by a board of 53 member states, including all the permanent members of the United Nations Security Council. At the GCSP, we are dedicated to providing the knowledge, skills, and network for effective and inclusive decision-making and proactive action. And we are pleased to celebrate our 25th anniversary in cooperation with our Foundation Council members, as well as the wealth of expertise represented also through the speakers and participants attending our 25th virtual event this week. It is my honor to welcome the distinguished member of this panel, and I thank all of them for taking the time out of their busy schedule to join us. At the end of the day, people make peace and security possible. This is why you, panelists and participants, have all been invited to join us today for our 25th anniversary celebration, and for this panel in particular. UN peace operations are as critical as ever. The only question is, in what form and how they can have the highest concrete and positive impact moving forward. Ladies and gentlemen, share your vision and spare no thought. Only together can we find the best solution that can ensure that the UN peace operation in the next or new normal have the impact it should. And with that, I wish you a productive session, and I'm pleased to hand back the word to Annika, the head of our peace operation and peace building work here at the GCSP, who will be facilitating the session. Thank you.
Thank you, Ambassador. Excellent. And indeed, as you said, UN peace operations are as critical as ever. And the question is only what form it should take to have the desired impact. In the current turbulent and transformational environment, much has and is being done when it comes to exploring what type of UN peace operations are required in the future. For example, the EPON network led by NUPI is generating groundbreaking research on what is currently working or not. Also, the UN Department for Peace Operations, as well as the IPI, have produced a series of excellent think pieces to stimulate our thinking and to generate proactive analysis on what could and possibly should come next. So, what we would like to do today is just take a step back and reflect. As we are all aware, in the last few days, literally, there has been some fundamental changes in the strategic political landscape that underpins and conditions UN peace operations. I am, of course, referring to the new US administration coming in. Last time Mr. Biden was in the White House, he and Mr. Obama presided over the Leaders' Peacekeeping Summit when over 50 heads of state met at the UN headquarters to pledge new, significant and concrete capabilities to boost UN and its peace operations. And the driving force behind that process was, of course, Victoria Holt, whom we are absolutely delighted for having joined us here this afternoon for the conversation. Having said that, the world today is a very different place than it was only 5 years ago. Poverty, organized crime, nationalism, violent conflict, and the climate crisis have increased exponentially. And on top of it, or rather accelerating the situation, is the pandemic. All is on the rise and increasing in intensity. So what now? What type of peace operations do we need in 2030? This is what we are about to focus on this afternoon. So ladies and gentlemen, I will introduce our panelists as I invite them for their respective initial 3-minute intervention to begin our collective brainstorming. After this and some first reaction and exchanges amongst the panelists, we will then open up for propositions and comments in the chat. And it appears that the relevance of the topic and the timing could not have been better. Both panelists and participants have responded to the invitation with equal force and commitment. We recognize and welcome all of you and appreciate that beyond this very distinguished panel, amongst the participants, we have former Undersecretary Generals, Assistant Secretary General, Special Representative of the Secretary General, we have a Force Commander, Police Commissioner, and leading think tankers, and many more. So thank you all for coming. You're all warmly welcome. This session today is only the beginning. Because of the limited time and the number of panelists, we regret that we will only be able to pick up a few ideas and questions in the chat. But coming out of this session, a GCSP policy brief will be produced. So beyond the conversation here, we warmly welcome you to forward any of your thoughts, ideas, and questions also separately. And of course, in particular, if we can quote you and give you credit for them, that would be even better. So, to the topic. In which direction is UN peace operations heading? Although large multidimensional peace operations continue to constitute the main part of UN peace operations today, increasingly smaller specialized political missions are launched in order to put more emphasis on finding political solutions to the causes of conflict. So reflecting this trend, Charles Petrie, former Assistant Secretary General, Executive Representative of the Secretary General to Burundi, and a member of the expert panel on peace building, will kick off our brainstorming session with highlighting some of the persistent challenges to peace operations, to today's large multidimensional peace operations, and share his views on a model which he believes in the future should have a greater role in the spectra of peace operations, tools and instruments, and which of course also would be in line with the conclusions and findings of the peace building review, as well as the high-level independent panel of peace operations findings. So without further ado, and I will introduce the speakers as they come on to speak following Charles. So Charles, over to you.
Thank you, Annika. I guess the value of a UN peacekeeping force should be its ability to create the conditions on the ground for the acceptance of a peaceful political transition. But the problem today may stem from the fact that peacekeeping, rather than being subscribed in a broader international effort, has become its defining component. The challenges facing peacekeeping seem to have as much to do with an increasingly difficult to define end state, the quality and motivation of the troops deployed, the level of risk troop contributing countries are willing to take, as it does the impact on the ground of the long-term deployment of troops. Of these factors, possibly the most complicated is the conceptual definition of the end state. This remains to be the attempt to reestablish some form of state structure with a central authority. But in many of today's fragile or failed states, this is unachievable, at least in the immediate. The implosion of strong central authority, which defines the essence of what constitutes the fragility of these states, has allowed politicians and warlords to exacerbate existing tensions and differences between communities to gather support and assert their control along clan or ethnic lines. The result in many cases is the emergence of a mosaic of homogeneous geographic areas, populations having fled previously integrated or mixed areas to find security among their own. For decades, Somalia was seen as an outlier, but today the country could be viewed as having been a precursor to the situations now prevalent in Afghanistan, Central African Republic, Iraq, Libya, and even South Sudan. Thus, the UN peacekeepers' attempt to project the authority of an administration in the capital to outlying areas frequently involves asserting the control of one group over others, and naturally generates tensions and violence. A second complication has to do with the quality and capability of the troops themselves. Training, of course, can contribute to strengthening of UN contingents, and a number of troop contributing countries have courageously demonstrated their willingness to accept certain levels of risk, even to take casualties to achieve the mission given to them. But it is not uniformly the case. And as a result, some UN troop deployments end up over time being little more than forces occupying geographical space, with the corresponding impact that the local deterrent aspect of the deployments is lost. An ancillary to this challenge is the advisability of deploying troops from neighboring countries to occupy areas that are adjacent to their countries of origin, as was the case and may continue to be the case in the Central African Republic and Mali. Such deployments could be seen to challenge the very definition of peacekeeping, compromising the neutrality and the impartiality of the mission. The deployment of large numbers of troops also creates new economic realities in the areas where they are stationed. Governance challenges emerge as the forces are frequently far better equipped and served than the local administrations they are meant to be supporting, with the result that the credibility and authority of local administrations are undermined. Finally, the increasing responsibility included in Security Council peacekeeping mandates comes with the increasing responsibilities included in the Security Council peacekeeping mandates, comes the corresponding growth in the capacity of the missions to accomplish the tasks. By taking on more direct roles in governance and service delivery, peacekeeping interventions end up disempowering and de-responsibilizing local actors. Further compounding this phenomenon of local disempowerment is the fact that UN operations attract the more qualified and better educated elements of the community. Basically, those most needed to reestablish acceptable governance, accept jobs well below their competencies for the better remuneration. What can be done to address these challenges? The recent implementation of the Secretary General's reform regarding the UN presence in country offers new opportunities for UN peace operations. Over the last year, I've been involved in the mentoring of some 10 resident coordinators operating in conflict settings. It has been fascinating to observe how delinking the resident coordinator position from an individual agency responsibility has strengthened the position's ability to convene and coordinate. A more cohesive and coherent UN system in-country response should in turn free UN peacekeeping from the need to duplicate tasks that could be undertaken by other UN agencies. Thus, an alternative form of UN peace operation could involve the deployment of a senior political structure to which would be attached a focused security sector capacity building arm and a well-equipped quick reaction force. Security would be undertaken through the strengthening of the local law and order capabilities, supported by the deployment of police trainers. Spikes of insecurity and/or mass violence would be dealt with through the rapid deployment of the well-armed and highly trained quick reaction unit ready to intervene at a moment's notice with the mandate to use overwhelming force. Once the situation contained, the element would withdraw and would leave the consolidation of the peace to the local security forces, trained and supported by the police trainers of the mission, working in close collaboration with the broader UN system. Voilà.
Thank you very much, Charles, for raising those hard-hitting facts and the challenges with the big multidimensional missions. We should also, of course, there are many perspectives to these issues. And as Lisa Howard and others have pointed out, there is a positive impact on the big multidimensional missions as well. But there are indeed negative consequences that need to be addressed. I would, before commenting any further, I would then have the pleasure to introduce our second speaker or intervention, and just highlighting therefore that a second major trend in addition to the fact that there are increasingly special political missions being deployed, we also have the second major trend, which is the UN peace operations, which has had a steady increase in terms of number and specialization of policing in UN peace operations. And we are therefore equally delighted to have the UN police advisor, Luis Carrillo, make the second intervention. Many of the issues facing missions today stems from the breakdown of law and order, transnational organized crime, human trafficking, corruption, and cybercrime. And UN policing, in whatever form and framework, is likely to play a critical role also moving forward. And in addition, the UN Police Division, I would like to highlight here, has been championing the strength and role of women in peace operation, and thus acting as a beacon and positive role model for the rest of the system. And we, of course, look forward to seeing how this can be further emphasized also moving forward in the future. And finally, I'd just like to mention that 10 days ago, when all the UN heads of police components brainstormed on the future of policing in 2030, we were so inspired by the richness of the conversation and the ideas put forward by the police commissioners that we decided to pull together this panel and build on that conversation and broaden the agenda to put the politics at the center. So without further ado, I'm handing over the word to Luis, the police advisor.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Annika. Distinguished fellow panelists, ladies and gentlemen. First, let me congratulate the Geneva Center for Security Policy and thank Annika for organizing this webinar. And of course, my presentation will build on the rich discussions that, as you just said, we had with the heads of our police components in the field missions during the last United Nations Police Week early this month. As you may know, this year we celebrate 60 years of the United Nations policing, and of course, we have been passing quite a few time reflecting on how far we have come since our first deployment in Congo 60 years ago, where a small police contingent was deployed under the auspices of the military. This milestone and the unprecedented challenges the world has witnessed this year, in particular, present a good opportunity for all of us to consider our role looking towards 2030. We strongly believe that United Nations policing has proven time and again to be both resilient and flexible given the variety of current missions, from large multi-dimensional peacekeeping operations, like it was the case, as Charles just said, in Central African Republic, Darfur, Democratic Republic of Congo, Mali, South Sudan, to smaller smaller missions, targeting and targeted political missions, like in places like Colombia, Haiti, Somalia, and also Yemen and Libya. We also have at our disposal rapid reaction capabilities with our standing police capacity, or SPC as we call, which enable us to provide policing services and expertise across the peace continuum in mission settings, but also non-mission settings. For example, our standing police capacity officers are currently advising Nigerian authorities on how police reform and have recently provided assistance to Angola, Maldives, and Zambia on human rights and policing amidst the COVID-19 pandemic. By deploying specialized police teams, we have been able to provide timely, tailored operational and capacity building support to host state counterparts in areas such as forensics, sexual and gender-based violence, organized crime, in many other missions. No doubt, future challenges will demand that we remain agile and innovative in terms of deployment modalities and compositions. Adequately balancing military and police assets in response to host state requirements and throughout mission life cycles in line with each component's rules and comparative advantage is key to paving the way for sustaining peace. Thanks to our training, methods, and equipment, the police are often better prepared to address public order disturbances, crime and criminal violence, including serious and organized crime and other conflict drivers, as we can watch nowadays. This is particularly true in settings with high levels of urban violence. For example, as we saw in Haiti during the transition from multidimensional peacekeeping operation to MINUSTA to the first rule of law justice mission and police mission, MINUJUST. UNPOL were critical in building the capacities of Haitian National Police to address criminal gang activity. Police reform as part of broader rule of law reform is important aspect of transitions in exit and exit strategies. Since early this century, the Security Council has mandated UNPOL across the board to help build the policing capacities of host state counterparts. Of course, we do it with all the stakeholders, bilateral, multilateral organizations, and also all the agencies, funds, and programs. To ensure more coherent approaches to the provision of police reform and assistance to host state police services, we have developed with member states and partners the Strategic Guidance Framework for International Policing, or SGF, which serves as a blueprint for our present and future support that is internationally accepted, human rights compliant, gender responsive, and evidence-based. I will conclude soon. Ladies and gentlemen, as our Secretary General has noted, the future of peacekeeping operation is linked to the United Nations Police. A key political tool for the organization, UNPOL, support and advance all the UN peace and security, human rights and development objectives, building on action for peacekeeping and the 2030 agenda. Living up to the full promise will require continually evaluating and addressing several strategies, responding to the increasing complexity of operations and high-risk environment, aligning mandated tasks, authorized postures, and available resources. 3, increasing nominations of personnel with required skill sets. 4th, ensuring mobile units are well-trained and well-equipped. 5th, accessing the maximizing new technologies, and finally, mitigating the environmental impact of peace operations. Throughout our existence, we have met enormous challenges, a testament to the agility of our enterprise and the strength of our partnerships. Partnerships is key. Working with the member states and other partners, we hope to have resources, positioning, and access required to effectively implement our mandated tasks while making a meaningful impact on the lives of the people we serve for many years to come. Thank you very much once again, and congratulations to you, Annika, and to GCSP.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. And also thank you on behalf of the ambassador. I should also mention that he, as we are running a number of sessions, he had to leave because he's leading another session. So, but thank you so much. And thank you for putting forward this very rich agenda for the policing and also for the UN. And I think one of the things we talked about, the steady increase of UN police in peace operations. At the same time, it's still approximately 10% in terms of comparison to uniform components with the military, and given the changing nature of the conflict and the required tools to meet those challenges, it is rather strange. So I think in our internal conversation prior to hosting this session, we were all talking about 2030. It's time to flip the ratio. Should it be 10% military and 90% policing, which is of course something that probably the police advisor would like, and the member states are a little bit slower to engage. But anyway, it's worthwhile and a lot of interesting things. And I think what also came forward was the fact that the policing, and also from the brainstorming session during the police week, of course, the focus in 2030 is probably be protecting our civilians and capacity building being the main core component of policing. But at the same time, all these other new items and dimensions and policing in non-mission settings and so on is also really interesting. So thank you very, very much for that. We will steam ahead with our next speaker. And this is, of course, the one I alluded to early in the session. Because following these two initial interventions based on the development, the special political, political component, and the development of the policing in UN operations. Now we would really like to take this. What does this all mean, the future of peace operations in the light of the incoming US administration? Of course, it's too early to tell. But at least we hope that our dear colleague Victoria Holt can share some thoughts on what that both. I know the initial conversation we had was on the propositions made by Charles. So I think Victoria will make some initial comments on that, on his proposals, but also from your perspective, Victoria, where do you see UN peace operations 2030? Where should it be? And of course, in the light of this new US administration. Over to you.
Thanks very much, Annika, and congratulations to the Geneva Center for its 25th anniversary, and it's a pleasure to be here. Obviously, we all know the reasons that the nature of conflict is expanding and changing, and in some senses, you're asking us to look forward to how do you address that fundamental problem. And I'll say we often forget how much the UN itself is constantly evolving and responding to the challenges of the past. And so just since the end of the Cold War, you've seen what a range of architecture. So I just want to give some credit first to the constant effort to renew and revive and address previous problems that is ongoing today at the UN. I know of multiple studies, whether it's technology, the Department of Peace Operations, Insight, DPPA, et cetera, DOS, everybody's working to look forward. So I just want to acknowledge that. And then we sometimes forget there's everything from observer missions to executive authority operations. We've had robust peacekeeping missions, multi-dimensional ones, and some that focus just on police. So I think in some sense, part of the answer is let's pull out all those tools and better align the challenge in the field, meeting the objectives with capacity. We always say this, to some extent, it's what Charles is trying to point to. One size does not fit all. And so a better look at police certainly makes much sense. I'll briefly say in the post-conflict environments for some of the multidimensional missions, police were expanded, but you quickly realize governments are greedy. They don't want to hand them over to the UN sometimes. It's hard to get foreign police units that then match the mission. I would ask my colleague how that looks right now. Part of the capacity gap the UN's faced in the past. I remember lobbying for French-speaking female police officers. And then you also need the whole rule of law system. If you're going to detain an individual, then what? And if the state itself is in trouble, you're trying to do multiple things at the same time. So I would absolutely applaud thinking about police and rule of law. To Charles's point about speedy, rapid reaction, I think that's been on everybody's list since we ever thought about peace operations, and that is an excellent idea. But I will recall the mission in Darfur was designed with that in mind, and the government was not interested in necessarily all the capabilities being deployed or deployed quickly. So I think that sometimes you bump into the host state problem. So let me quickly mention a few things, and then you've encouraged us to have a big idea. We've recently done the Stimson Center with UN University, a study on the political practice of peacekeeping. So if we know the peace operations in the future need to fundamentally support a political peace, just a few observations that may help that move forward. First, the strategy should drive the mandate, which then drives the capacity. So that requires a good understanding of the local and regional dynamics. It sounds obvious, but it's worth doing, maybe even having a two-step procedure for how the council handles mandating. And we've seen in places also where a peace agreement can actually facilitate and support peace, but other times it can actually be a distraction, where the answer to a peace agreement is to buy some time and get the parties lined up. So yes, peacekeeping needs a political agreement at its core, but that may not be perfectly lined up at the moment of deployment. And in some cases, it can actually distract from delivering. I will not read you my quote from the Srebrenica report, but you know that sometimes an overemphasis on the process of negotiation can miss the fact that violence is continuing and the killing may continue. So you have to both get a peace agreement and stop the killing and the violence. So also sometimes the lack of a really concrete peace dividend for the local community can wear the patience also that Charles pointed to. So when I get to my last point, I think better thoughtfulness about starting at the beginning, how you build that peace dividend, the peace building strategy. We've learned that security requires governance, but it may also require real support to other needs of communities. And then finally, political strategies and protection of civilians are tied together. These are not separate competitive enterprises. They relate directly, and I'd be happy to get into that more. And I think that that's another point, which is that today's wars, today's conflicts often purposely target civilians, or they become those greatly affected. Everybody knows the numbers of displacement around the world. We know that what extremists often do is target civilian communities, as do governments and militia. Or the lack of security, the lack of basic needs can put people on the move. So I think that's with us to stay. It may not be the central point for all peacekeeping missions, but I don't think that we're looking at it either or here. So two maybe additional recommendations, and then I'll turn it back over. One, we have to be really clear what is peace operations and what is not. And by that, I mean war fighting. Peacekeeping is not peace enforcement. And I think there's been a real challenge to understand where, say, the UN and the Security Council will embrace a coalition, a regional effort, but maybe it's civilian, but at times, if you're using force, we have to be really careful not to make peacekeeping missions to assume that they can take on that role. That debate's been going on forever, but I think it might be a moment to really think about the architecture. Who can do that job? What can the UN do? How do those work together? And then related to that, for the bigger idea, I want to congratulate the UN on some real visionary work. The Department of Support has an environment strategy which looks at how to move the UN into more use of energy efficiency and renewable energy. The Secretary General has laid out a goal for the UN to align its own missions with the climate goals, to get down to 80% renewable energy for all UN mission activities. Both of those mean that peacekeeping missions can move from its near 100% reliance on diesel to more renewable options. Why? To make the missions more secure, save money, be more effective, reduce pollution, maybe shorten some supply chains. We won't get rid of diesel, but to move into renewable energy will help the mission. How is this a big idea? If you start from the beginning, which many missions have already begun to do, and I could give you the great list, you could then build with a transition to work with the country teams, the SDG goals of that country, and the climate commitments of those countries to figure out how that UN presence, which is often in a fragile state with low investment, not necessarily where money is coming in to support new technology, to try and accelerate that, to provide a little bit more leverage to give access to energy, meet the climate goals of the country. So peacekeeping still needs to do its top goals. None of this is abstracted from that, but I think the UN has laid out a vision here that member states and much of the field is already beginning to embrace, and that could be accelerated as part of the peace dividend for future missions. Thanks, and back over to you.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Tori, for that and for pointing out, of course, the need for effective strategies, priorities, and also the division of labor when the issue of the use of force need to be addressed in the most effective way and not necessarily by, or not primarily by the UN peace operations. I also appreciate in particular that you were highlighting the development and the innovation that is currently an ever ongoing, and of course the environmental dimensions to that. Reminding me on the fact that of course we've been working on mainstreaming gender for 20 years, has been at the forefront, and we made, I must say, lots of progress, both by the police division but also others, and the gender parity of course has been really positively having a good impact. Of course there's a long way to go, but if we can do the same with the climate challenge, with the environment, to have that focus, at least of course we know it's urgent, we don't have 20 years, but still there could also be seen to see what did we do right and what did we do wrong to mainstream gender, and use that also for the environmental dimension. And finally, I just want to highlight back and re-emphasize the issue you said about innovation, which is really the definition. I know there's different views on this also within the panel, but I really think that innovation is such a core component of UN peace operations. And again, if I allow me to, when we had this session together with EPON and NUPI recently during the Geneva Peace Week, where the two recently studies on the effectiveness of MINUSCA and also UNAMID, done by, or led by, I should say, by Lisa Howard on the UNAMID, and Ralph Mamia, our colleague here at the GCSP, a fellow, on UNAMID, that really the one thing that came out in that conversation, the Geneva Peace Week, was the central part of innovation as defining peace operations. So thank you for highlighting that and providing a lot of other good food for thoughts. Now, ladies and gentlemen, it's my absolute pleasure to introduce the next panelist to give an intervention. And here now we will be looking at, in this new environment, with, as we know, there's no peace operations without political will. And with the incoming US administration, there will hopefully be a stronger political will. So, but how will this work now for the United Nations, especially given the overall agreement on the primacy of politics in conflict resolution in general and for peace operations in particular? So we could not have been joined by a better panelist to talk about that than Mr. Jeffrey Feltman, who is the former Undersecretary General for Political Affairs of the United Nations. And of course, Jeff is also a seasoned senior US diplomat with this combined experience of the UN system as well as that of driving US politics. We very much look forward to your intervention. Over to you.
Annika, thank you very much. It's a real, I appreciate being invited to join this distinguished panel, and congratulations again to the Geneva Center on 25 years. You know, we're also commemorating this year, of course, the 75th year of the United Nations itself. And if you look at the United Nations, of course, it addresses many global challenges through multilateral instruments. But at its heart, the irreducible purpose of the UN is peace and security. It's the topic we're talking about today. That's why the UN came together, was to deal with peace and security. So I think it's very appropriate that you're having this discussion today for your 25th anniversary and the UN's 75th anniversary. But if you look around the world today, and the last statistics I have are from the period 2013 to 2017. 93–94% of all battle-related casualties, all battle-related deaths, have taken place in places where there's not peacekeeping. It's the Syrias, the Yemens, the Afghanistans, the Nigerias, Iraq of the world. There's not peacekeeping in those places. And I think we all know, we've always discussed the changing nature of conflict and why those venues aren't necessarily appropriate for peacekeeping. But it means that we don't yet have an effective international response to where most of these battlefield deaths are occurring, and where, of course, most of the refugees and IDPs, the humanitarian crises, are occurring. And there's some structural issues that others have touched on that affect the ability of peacekeeping to be mandated and to be deployed. And let me just mention a few of them. That fusion of civil wars that have become proxy wars that have fused into transnational terrorism. You know, where, to pick up on what Toria said, peacekeeping is not war fighting, but yet when you have a civil war that is affected by transnational terrorism, that has proxy elements in it, like Syria, we don't yet have an answer for how you deal with those, and that's where the largest humanitarian crises are occurring. You also, and related to that is the paralysis in the Security Council. If you have a proxy war going on where you have one great power in the Security Council backing one side, another great power in the Security Council backing another side, you have paralysis. And the Security Council is not able to respond in an effective way. This is not the first time, of course, we've had paralysis in the Security Council, the early years of the UN during the Cold War. It's something I think we have to accept as part of the current geostrategic landscape and learn how to deal with. I also, the other speakers have also hinted at the issue of sovereignty concerns. No matter how weak the state may be or how dissolved the state may be, when it comes, the UN is the last bastion of state sovereignty. States protect their sovereignty in the UN context to the extent that they can. And if a state is unwilling to accept a UN peace operations, a US peace operation, that state can probably expect enough friends in the Security Council, enough sympathetic voices in the Security Council to prevent that peace operation from being authorized, or that state can affect how the peace operation is authorized. You look at the Colombia peace process, for example. The UN was a latecomer into the Colombia peace process. It came in at the request of the parties, and the mission that was eventually established looked like it was a peacekeeping operation, but it wasn't, because the Colombians didn't want blue helmets. They specifically didn't want blue helmets. It ended up being a political mission because of the direction of the sovereign state itself. And if the government embraces asking for peacekeeping operation, we have to ask ourselves, we need to look carefully at why are they embracing the peacekeeping operation? We want to make sure we don't affect the UN's impartiality, as others have said, in looking as though we're protecting a predatory regime of some sort. So the sovereignty concerns is something we always have to think about. Now, how do we overcome some of these structural, and of course there are more structural challenges than those I've mentioned. Others have talked about the impact of the coronavirus, the impact of climate change, and those sorts of things. But how could we address some of these issues? On the sovereignty issue, to the extent that we can define the peace operation as capacity building in the way that the police commissioner and Charles Petrie were talking about, in terms of looking at an increase in police presence, that might help overcome sovereignty concerns. That might help overcome that effective veto a sovereign state can often exercise over having a peace operation deployed, even when it's clearly necessary. Police operations look less threatening. They look less like the state has failed than a blue helmet did. So capacity building is an asset, I think, that we can use even on the security side in order to overcome that sovereignty issue. I also recommend that when we're looking at the need for a new peace operation, be it a peacekeeping operation, be it a special political mission, we work out the mandate outside of the Security Council context and bring it to the Security Council. In the same way that the Colombian parties worked with the UN and interested parties to define the mandate for the Colombia political mission, it wasn't negotiated in the Security Council. It was brought to the Security Council, tailor-made, and the Security Council was asked to endorse it and give the mandate. That's far easier than trying to negotiate inside the Security Council context or inside the New York context, where political differences among member states may affect the mandate thing. I also would encourage that we take a cue from what I would see as some of the more successful of the special political missions, which are the regional offices. The regional office for West Africa, the regional office for Central Africa, the regional office for Central Asia. Those mandates are quite flexible. Those mandates allow the political head, the SRSG, to have unusual flexibility in where he or she is going to deploy his or her assets, where he or she is going to travel. It's harder on peacekeeping because peacekeeping should be linked to an actual peace process. It shouldn't just be the ends to the means, as Charles said today in this 2017 paper and others have noted. But the flexibility given to the peace operations in West Africa, Central Africa, and Central Asia have allowed the SRSGs to see where they need to deploy their resources in a way that's hard for the Security Council to grapple with, but I think is useful. I also think that we need to look again at the multidimensional integrated missions. What parts of those might detract mission leadership from the political work at hand? I'm thinking more, because of my experience overseeing the political missions, of places like Libya, where the mediation and negotiations between the various components of Libya had to be the primary goal of the SRSG, but the size and depth of the integrated mission often distracted the leadership from the political issues toward management. And I'm wondering whether there needs to be another look at this, so that you can use all the tools the UN has, but in a way that frees up the SRSGs from some of the management challenges. Final comment. I think one of the biggest challenges that we have, and I don't have an answer for this, unfortunately, is how do we sustain the peace operations to the point of the local actors being able to continue on with their own sustainment of the capacities of the security services, et cetera. Because too often we've seen places where the country itself will want to, quote, graduate from that Security Council spotlight that's often uncomfortable. Or we'll have issues, and Tori, you and I know our country's often the ones. We'll have countries that will want to graduate the other country, the recipient of the peacekeeping operations, sooner than might be necessary, just because of cost-saving reasons. And so I think that one thing we have to look at is, what is the sustainability of the mission, given the fact that most of these have only year-to-year mandate renewals, sometimes even more frequent than that. And part of the answer may be picking up on what the police commissioner and picking up on what Charles said, which is that you can convert what would be a more robust peace operation into more of a capacity peace operation, a capacity building operation that is seen as less expensive to the financing states, and less threatening and more respectful to the recipient state. Again, thank you very much for allowing me to participate in this panel today.
Thank you very much. Thank you for a brilliant, very comprehensive intervention there, I would say. And of course, not only commenting on the initial model proposed by Charles, but also doing a critique of all the different tools in the current peace operations toolbox. I thought that was extremely helpful. And of course, it's just the beginning of the conversation, as we said. So we look forward to digging deeper to a number of those areas that you highlighted. And one thing that I thought was particularly interesting is, of course, we tend to think about, what type of peace operations do we need and how can we improve the ones that are currently operating. The fact that you highlighted the areas where the highest casualties are currently happening, which is in Syria and Yemen and elsewhere. What type of missions is required to be able to engage and support those people caught up in violence and conflict, and not only in the places where the missions currently are. So that was extremely helpful. Thank you so much for that. We will now turn our attention and continue with Ambassador Ahmed Abdullah, who was a member of the expert panel on peace building, and of course also a former special representative of the Secretary General to Somalia and then also to Burundi. The ambassador will bring in the field perspective in particular, I believe, having served both in Somalia and the Great Lakes region, both of which are still at the heart of concerns for peace operations to make things more effective and sustainable and achieving the mandates that they have been put to do. So without further ado, I'm handing over to, before I do that actually, I saw in the chat, I wanted to thank Yusuf Mahmoud also for providing, as I was highlighting, the excellent studies of IPI, and also, of course, for the conversation we had in the past weeks on those topics, and also Kari for highlighting also in the chat on the NUPI studies, EPON studies, so you can find them all that. And finally, I want to mention the other thing, which is that Richard Gowan is still joining us. He was already prior committed to a UN meeting, but he will join us. So hopefully by the end of this tour de table, he will be joining with his perspective. So without further ado, Ambassador, over to you, Abdullah.
Thank you very much. Thank you for convening this meeting. I think it should be given great importance because the UN peacekeeping operation, the UN program as a whole, is under strong critics and maybe opposed in a number of countries, especially where I am now in the Sahel. So this meeting is timely, and I hope with all the expertise you had, like Feltman, who has been in government and in the UN, and a number of you, you should pay a serious attention. Now, quickly, for me, we had UN peacekeeping before and after the Cold War. For me, the difference is the Cold War before and after. In 1956 or early 57, when we had peacekeeping between Israeli and Egyptian, it was peacekeeping between two states, two official armies. Since the end of the Cold War, we have no more, almost no more, peacekeeping between two formal armies. We have peacekeeping seen as part of the conflict because you are with the government who is fighting part of its population or vice versa and so on. We are not anymore on the original peacekeeping between two states, though they took part in Korea and so on, but it was mandated to fight. So the peacekeeping we had since then, like in Congo, has been in Congo since July 1960. It is not helping the image or effectiveness of the UN or peacekeeping and so on. Of course, it could be seen as an exception. But today, what is at stake is the effectiveness of peacekeeping, and beyond peacekeeping, the UN Secretary General and Secretariat and UN Security Council. So your program, what peacekeeping for 2030, is excellent, and I think you should go strongly forward, making suggestions really for peace and for credibility of the institution. We cannot just keep trying to be between armies, in one country, like in Central Africa, in other places. Since the end of the Cold War, as you know, civil war or an official army against part of its population, a tribe against a tribe. And this is not only Africa. You had it in former Yugoslavia. You had it everywhere in Armenia and Azerbaijan, Central Asia, everywhere, mostly in Africa. But we have to take this seriously because the environment today is much open. People in remote places have WhatsApp and they connect what they think of as in the UN Secretariat, Army, Police, Gendarmerie, and so on. So we have to have a serious conclusion to bring to the Secretary General and the rest. The army should not be seen, the national army should not be seen as a party. And when peacekeeping comes, like in Mali, I just arrived from Mali 3 weeks ago, they are very helpful. All peacekeeping, I saw it since I've been in a number of places, the contribution extraordinary for the economy, for bringing people together, but not to implement peace or to encourage peace. The peacekeeping are useful economically, not anymore in maintaining peace. On the contrary, if we don't do something, they might discredit the role, mandate, and discredit the UN and the Security Council, which is terrible because the 5 permanent members are needed. Now, what for the future? The future, in my opinion, is a consensus at the secretariat level first. If the Undersecretary General, like Mr. Feldman, his colleague in Peacekeeping, Political Affairs, Secretary General, and so on, reach a consensus with their advisor and all of you from think tanks and organizations like GCSP, they can sell a package discussed with member state or most interested Security Council member state. We just cannot do it like in the market, especially with informed combatant. You know, the Islamists in Somalia, the rebels in Mali, all have WhatsApp. If I had given, I think I know some connection, if I had given them my webinar, they would be listening to us. Even in Timbuktu, we are not in the 60s or 50s. They are connected, they have WhatsApp, they have their own communique. They need really physical deterrence or strong funding to stop them. In my memoir, because though I'm still young, I wrote my memoir, I suggested for UN credibility a sort of special force, which is very difficult to do, but UN Security Council and leading member state can help have a sort to fight the rebel or whatever. You remember these Islamists in Somalia able to cross in Kenya to attack an American base. We are not anymore in the 60s. We have sophisticated people with WhatsApp, with connection, with their own circuit to import and export product. So they are not anymore poor. They are rich, they have their own connection. So Secretariat to come with suggestion, including contribution from yours, special force, more specialized, like gendarmerie, the French type of gendarmerie, or the FBI, or whatever country, this kind of army and intelligence, police, special force, to be able to meet from time to time on instruction, force by force. The rebel in the Sahel have a good time, like in Somalia. They attack when they want. The other have to get a solution. The only credibility of the UN, and I will conclude here, is to maintain peace. The development is very important. But you all and me know that private investment is incredibly more important than the money we give through our institution, except for refugees. You know well that responsibility to protect, human rights protection. A number of countries can do whatever they want, no one can address them. So you have a great opportunity to be innovative, to cross the line, to come with assertive suggestion. And I think, between quote unquote, there is a market for it. There is demand for something new suggestion on how to make the international system effective, not a bureaucracy. I was long years in the UN. I don't think they are bureaucracies. I think we do a good job. But the world has changed because WhatsApp, because the wealth coming from many places. You have to respond to it. All this violence, and I conclude here, all communication, all public relation are met by rebellion, whatever terrorist, whatever Islamist, whatever parties, with their own radio and system. When they make a reception, they send it right away, and they know to whom they send it. They don't care if it is read in major capital, and they know how to communicate with them. So we have to address effective peacekeeping, and major countries can do it, a kind of special force, whatever their weakness, and they have to be sustainable. And in conclusion, the peacekeeping now today, I see them as useful economically. If they leave Mali, the economy will collapse. But they cannot bring peace if there were not the special French forces. And even with the French special forces, we see where we are. We see where Somalia is and Afghanistan is. And the rebel always keep reminding, where are you in Afghanistan? Where are you in Somalia? And it encourages, mobilizes their troops. So thank you very much. The suggestion, the proposal is very good. What peacekeeping for 2030? You have to think of it. It is possible. It is possible. It has to be based on what we have in, countries like US or European countries and so on. And finally, that Security Council is not unanimous. So how to be effective? Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ambassador, for raising a whole range of issues. And of course, I'm taking notes here. There was scribbling down lots of ideas. And I wanted just to highlight a few that I thought was particularly interesting. Of course, you started off talking about the move from the interstate conflicts to the intrastate conflict and changing nature. I think what's interesting now is, though, that given the increased political divisiveness across the world, and we see possibly a return to more interstate conflicts, will the changing nature also have an impact on what type of peace operations we are requiring. We know that only recently you had the conflict in Nagorno-Karabakh. Of course, there would be Russian peacekeepers, but then again, there might be similar situations elsewhere. And also, if there is an opportunity for the UN to provide the instruments for that type of peacekeeping situations, that would, of course, be very interesting. And also another thing, we talked about the changing nature as you are coming out of that, the changing nature of conflict. Of course, you will have noticed that today is also the launch of the Global Terrorist Index findings. And it was interesting to see that although we see all the problem and the challenges emerging, they also reported that for the past 5 years, there's been deterioration in or less terrorism around the world, which is quite interesting. But of course, with the exception of some of the countries like Afghanistan and elsewhere, where many of the conflicts are taking place. But overall, terrorism has actually gone down for the 5th year in a row, which I think we need to bear in mind. So the changing nature of conflict is still very dynamic, and you're pointing to that also in your comments. And of course, related to the initial proposition, the kickoff conversation by Charles with the the rapid reaction force element of the political, with your suggestion of a special force for the UN to be able to sharply engage as and when required, reminds me also of what the late Hedi Anabi was propagating. Was very much welcoming the intervention by the British forces in Sierra Leone back in 1999, I believe it was, and saw that as a model. And I know Ambassador Yvette Stevens, one of our GCSP fellow, who is also attending the seminar here, I know that she also raised it as something to really bear in mind when use of force is required. And finally, I appreciate that you also connected the importance of development. All of this, of course, that related to peace operation has to be framed and supporting the sustainable development goals. We all know that if addressing the root causes of conflict is the real priority, and everything else should just be in line and in support of that. Without further ado, thank you so much. Now it is my absolute, I want to welcome Richard Gowan. We did say that you missed the bus and didn't make it in time. No, we said that you were in an important meeting elsewhere, but we're very happy that you're joining us for this conversation. And anything I said about you is not true, so just so you know. But more seriously, now we're moving to have a military perspective on the potential model for peace operations in 2030. And we will have an equally sharp and to the point intervention by Major General Robert Gordon, who is a former force commander and one of the key penholders of the development of the UN principles and guidelines for peace operations, the Capstone Doctrine, which I think despite everything still stands today. And I should also add that more recently, he was also a key penholder for the new Authority Command and Control guidelines, which is thought to be helping the coherence, the effectiveness and coordination of peace operations, which we all know is often a big challenge for missions. So without further ado, the floor is yours, Robert.
Good afternoon, Annika and fellow panelists and everyone who's sad enough to be watching us today. A great day with the 25th anniversary. Many congratulations to the GCSP on the 75th anniversary. And I very much like Jeff Feldman's juxtaposition between those two, between the 25 and the 75 years. And actually, we all quite atavistically want to know the future. And it's a very common human trait. And it's probably just as good to gather some wise heads together rather than just looking at which direction the swans are flying today. So a very useful and helpful exercise. And thank you, fellow colleagues, for saying everything that I probably wanted to say myself, but don't have to now. I just probably should confess that I'm a very strong believer in the United Nations and how the United Nations, particularly in its deployment for peacekeeping operations, has saved countless lives. It is not a perfect system. And I think those practitioners on the ground and practitioners in the Secretariat know it is not a perfect system. But I do believe they make every effort, and I compliment Tori on identifying this. The Secretariat does try and adapt to change. It is innovative. And I'd just like to make the point, actually, Annika, whether you were beginning to feel that evolutionary change is not innovative. It is. Where I come from is I'm not necessarily someone who would say revolutionary change is what is necessary. And I say that because I'm not sure how stable revolutionary change is, and also because I sort of feel from knocking around United Nations for a number of years now that there is a degree of change exhaustion going on amongst all the good people in headquarters and in the field. And I would like to see us as an organization and people who support the organization just try and implement some of the really good initiative and innovations that have been put in place already. I mean, it is, you've mentioned Capstone Doctrine. 20 years ago, we had the fabulous Brahimi report. 20 years ago, and we still haven't implemented it. 5 years ago, and we've got panelists here, we had the high-level panel. We still haven't implemented. And so to start, I think, asking for even more revolutionary change before we've implemented those things which we know and have identified could possibly be undertaken, I think is probably premature. So I come from the background of saying, let us just evolve the changes. 2030 is only around the corner. This is not looking too far ahead. And if it takes us as long as it does to implement other changes in the past, we will need to build on what we already have. Now, you want me to talk about military things, and I will be very quick because I realize we haven't got a lot of time. We all, and Charles's concept paper, very nice, and I liked your point, Charles, and I think we would all want to aspire to that. We all look at the field and we see clunky, clumsy, overbearing UN peacekeeping operations, and we don't particularly want that. We want nimbleness, we want fastness, we want quick deployment, we want fast reaction, we want to protect civilians properly and not just talk about it. We all understand that, and I think there are a lot of measures developing now within the Secretariat to make us better at doing that. But I just caution, I haven't heard it today, about legitimacy. We still are absolutely dependent on those principles of consent and legitimacy in peacekeeping operations. And if we go into peacekeeping operations with the concept of having fast, agile forces able to use overwhelming force, we are going to start losing legitimacy very quickly. I notice that fast, agile forces operating with overwhelming force didn't do much in Afghanistan or in Iraq. So it is something we have to be quite careful about before we advocate those issues of overuse of force, because I think the whole business of force is a very tricky business in UN peacekeeping operations. And the USGs and other speakers have identified that UN peacekeeping is not using overwhelming force for overcoming an opposition and a conflict process. UN peacekeeping is a very politically driven organization. And if we're looking at the military components and the military part of peace operations in the future up to 2030, I think we have the blueprints already in place. I think we all agree that we need much stronger and better conflict analysis before making Security Council resolutions. And in that conflict analysis, we need much better and more vocal military guidance in that conflict analysis. And we've got a long way to go before that. We understand, I think, that we need a lot of good pre-deployment training, and we need the standards for that pre-deployment training to be measured against. We need the technology, and we need to leverage this technology that we have available to us. And Ambassador Abdullah mentioned this. And in that technology, I would include strategic communications. I think strategic communications in the future, 2030, is actually a winner for UN peacekeeping, and we're not very good at it. And we could be very much better, both in the political sense and in the military sense. We've also spoken about partnerships, use of parallel forces, how we work together with other organizations who may have the capability to do things in the field, which this intractable environment is now presenting us with. So partnerships are critical, and the Secretariat understands that, and we try and work towards that. And if I could just say one last thing, and I think it is leadership, and we keep saying, and people say, oh, Robert would be saying that, but my goodness, I still think we've got a long way to go to actually select, train, prepare our leaders, not just our senior leaders, but especially our senior leaders, but also the leaders of military. And I'm talking military now, military components, who often go into these missions and don't really understand what that political context of the use of military force is in somebody else's country, and how political that whole process is. Now, I could go on for quite a long time, and I won't. I just want to end up with one thought, though, which I think is a contribution to this process. We've all agreed that we are living in a fast, rapidly changing world, and we need to adapt ourselves. I've had this feeling now for a number of years that the environment has outstripped our understanding and capability to deal with it. And in fact, what I'm saying is that we haven't got the doctrine to manage this new environment as we used to have in the old days of peacekeeping, immediately post-Brahimi and Capstone Doctrine. We're now faced with a rapidly changing world with all those other pressures in that we have discussed, not least transnational organized criminal activity, extremism, social medias and these other things, but we don't have the doctrinal backup to support that, not just within the Secretariat or within New York, but actually in member states. And I think it would be tremendously helpful if think tanks such as are represented here can start thinking about how do we develop a doctrine for peace operations in the future, peace operations in which peacekeeping isn't given the whole panoply of doing everything, but to pick up Charles's point, peacekeeping becomes focused, but the rest of the UN family work alongside that peacekeeping effort in an overall peace operation, using and deploying the whole UN family. SG's reforms are moving us down that line, but I think doctrinally we've got a little bit more to go. Thank you very much.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Robert, for that very, as always, thought-provoking intervention. And if I may say, I both agree and disagree with you to start off. Of course, I do agree that the focus should be on implementation. There was an enormous effort by the international community, also including led by the panelists also present here, on the reform agenda during 2015, in particular with the different high-level reports. I do disagree with you, though, that nothing has happened and nothing has been implemented. I think a whole range of issues has actually made progress, both on the Brahim report, but also in particular on the Hippo report, if I can comment on that one. And just highlighting, you mentioned the importance of leveraging technologies, which is of course keys. I remember, and you took the example of strategic communications. I remember the effort it was to give it 2 paragraphs in that whole report. I think it was 70 pages, the Hippo. And it was only 2 paragraphs on 2 recommendations on strategic communication. And it was the one thing, moving from one-way communication to have it interactive, both informing and receiving using strategic communications rather than public information. And I think the good news is we've gone way beyond that, possibly also partially thanks to COVID pandemic, that strategic communications has now really come to the forefront, and it's not at the end of 1 recommendations out of 70 pages, but it's different. So I would like to challenge it on that. Of course, there's many things.
I'd like to tell you back. I never said nothing has been implemented.
No.
Don't put words into my mouth.
Sorry about that.
Implementing the recommendations of those reports.
Okay, absolutely. Sorry about that. So I'm just saying that I think there's progress, but I do agree with the point that implementation rather than always looking for new things is very key. So I agree on that one as well. And if I can just also then loop back to, as you were referring also to Charles, comment on the need for flexible, agile forces, and then to put them in context that it's not only the solutions. We look at the situation in high technology and the capabilities in Afghanistan. It's not always the solution. But I also referring back, I think that it's not an all or nothing, as you also point out. We can look at the several situations, both the Rapid Reaction Force, part of the bigger UN mission in Liberia, 2003, 2006, with Swedish and Irish Rapid Reaction Force. And there's a number of other examples to be raised where you have this combination of different forces, very useful. And then I think also Jack Christofides have signed up for register for the seminar. Of course, being one of those proponents of the Force Intervention Brigade, would also be interesting to hear how there are many lessons from these kind of combined components when we need to engage with more use of force, but then again, not make that overtake the situation. Now we have our final speaker who will share with us. It's Richard Gowan, who is the UN director of the International Crisis Group, who will now be sharing the Richard perspective, I think, the leading one of the leading think tankers on this topic. Richard, over to you.
Well, thank you very much, Annika, and I'm sorry that other commitments meant that I did have to join this seminar a bit late. I would definitely like to follow Robert and wish GCSP a very happy 25th birthday. I was last physically at GCSP almost exactly 1 year ago for a discussion of Europe and the multilateral system. But one thing I discovered on that visit was that just across the road from GCSP's office is a building that houses something called the International Tequila Council. And I have to say, when I discovered that this existed, I realized by focusing on the Security Council, I had been wasting my time, and I should really have spent my life analyzing the International Tequila Council, and it would probably be much more fun. But sadly, I have committed over the years to focusing on the Security Council. And what I want to briefly say actually picks up on something that Jeff was pointing out as I joined the call, which is that however we imagine the future of UN peace operations, we have to accept that what the UN can do is going to be shaped by the politics of the Security Council, and we should assume that those politics will be relatively dysfunctional. I would say, and I think everyone would agree, that we are still not back in a Cold War style situation in the Security Council. In 1959, when we were in the Cold War, the Council passed one resolution in an entire year. Today, the Council regularly bangs out resolutions week after week. By historical standards, we still have a fairly well-functioning Security Council. And I think something that we can feel positive about is that actually, although we have seen a very significant decline in the quality of P5 relations over the last decade, the P5 still broadly consent to cooperate around peace operations. When discussing South Sudan, or the DR Congo, or indeed Mali, there are tensions and differences between the P5, but they very rarely reach for their vetoes. And actually, peacekeeping in Africa is probably the area where the Council remains most functional at the present time. However, I think we do have to ask, if we're imagining peace operations in 2030, how could the evolution of the Security Council and geopolitical relations more generally affect what is possible one decade from now? I think there are three scenarios, and one is the continuation of the status quo. I think it is quite possible that despite a overall decline in the quality of great power relations, possibly mitigated by the arrival of the Biden administration, we will find ourselves in 2030 in a world where great power relations are difficult, but still all the P5 see a common interest in maintaining peace operations in Africa, even if they have many differences elsewhere. And I can see that, although there are tensions over how those operations will be run, with China and Russia, for example, arguing that the UN should focus less on human rights, you could still overall have a strategic consensus on the utility of blue helmets a decade from now. There is, however, a worst case scenario, and that is we will see a further steep decline in P5 relations that makes cooperation over peacekeeping difficult. And that steep decline could be initiated by something entirely out of the realm of the discussion we're having today. If, for example, by accident or design, the US and China stumbled into a conflict over Taiwan or a conflict in the South China Sea, that would have no relation to the normal business of the Security Council, but I think it would almost certainly make it much, much harder for US and Chinese diplomats to continue to cooperate on peace operations in New York. So I think that all our discussions of peace operations are overshadowed by the risk that some event at the geopolitical level will simply blow up the P5 to an even greater extent than Syria or Ukraine has done today. There is also another, I think, more positive example, and something we should explore, which is that actually the P5 could start to see UN peace operations as a way to mitigate their differences in the conflicts and proxy conflicts with which they're currently engaged. Now, this is something that I have spent a bit of time working on in the context of Ukraine. Jeff and I have discussed this in the context of Ukraine. There did seem to be a possibility some years ago that a UN peace operation might provide a way out of the conflict over Donbass. That sadly has proved to be a false hope. But at the moment we see a more positive development by which the UN is moving towards a ceasefire in Libya that will probably be overseen by a lightweight monitoring presence connected to the existing political mission. And you can imagine other scenarios, other cases. Nagorno-Karabakh might have been one if the conflict had taken a different line, in which P5 members would choose to turn to the UN to manage their differences and mitigate conflicts which they're directly involved in or more likely involved in through proxies and allies. And I think that my concluding point is that we're very focused on peace operations in Africa, rightly so. We must continue to be so. That's where we are. But we should also be trying to think imaginatively about peace operations in other areas where the P5 rub up against each other. And I don't think those peace operations will, by and large, involve large numbers of blue helmets. They probably won't involve very many blue helmets at all. But we could be thinking about political missions or military missions that would observe deconfliction processes, as is currently taking place under the Russian aegis in Nagorno-Karabakh. We should be thinking about lightweight options for monitoring ceasefires in areas where the P5 are involved, as in Libya. And a lot of the time, as over Ukraine, these options won't work out. But I think that if we're accepting that we live in a world of big power frictions, the UN should be thinking about how they can ease those frictions as best they can. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Richard, for putting us back in the big picture of things, really looking at the strategic political different scenarios that we might be looking at. And we all know that peacekeeping is the extension of politics by other means. So everything will flow from that. And of course, as we discussed, we started off saying that we do indeed all recognize the impetus of the new dynamism with the new US administration will have, given that the US is, as everybody knows, attending the seminar, is almost funding 1/3 of UN peacekeeping and peace operations. Of course, it is a major component in this whole puzzle that we have been exploring. Not only I realize that we are running out of time. It's been extremely useful and rewarding. I have very much also noted, I know also the panelists, the chat that has been going on, and see some really interesting comments raised on the policing, both by Robert Perito and Hervé Offray. And we also had comments from Jonathan Fowler, Sahara Karim, General Engman, and Alcopas, our Argentinian colleagues. I've also saw that Carolina Messini has said, and Hester Panera, the first female police commissioner in UNAMID, have come a long contribution to this conversation. So I really do think that we see this as a wonderful beginning of the conversation. And I think the different comments, and not least Richard here, I didn't comment specifically on yours, but it's really feeding out to this new kind of a mosaic of scenarios that we're looking at. And I would like to come back to the idea of peace operations being the definition of innovation. And it's actually not only in the hands of the innovation and creativity of those the key stakeholders for peace operations, but also those that make it happen, the member states and those supporting. I would like, since we kicked it off with the innovation the kickoff paper by Charles Petrie, if you want to have some concluding thoughts, and we will come back to all of those of you who made comments, and please forward more suggestions and so on as we'll put together an outcome policy brief from this conversation. Charles.
Yeah, no, thanks, Annika. No, I think we actually we're not far from each other in our thinking. I mean, the three things that came out for me. One is, the question of whether big peace operations or peacekeeping operations are still the model of the future, unlikely. But the 3 points that I think that did come out much more relevant. One is the need for peace operations potentially to transition from force to capacity building, and the capacity building of local security, local rule of law, in collaboration with the rest of the UN system. So have a much more comprehensive approach. But using capacity building, I think Jeff, you mentioned it at the beginning, maybe highlighting much more the capacity building dimension of peacekeeping can actually make it more legitimate and more acceptable in contexts of conflict. Yeah. The quick reaction bit, responding to Robert, is much more of a very self-contained. The idea for me, why it came to mind, is actually April '94 in Kigali. If rather than withdraw the Belgian troops for a very short period of a week, the force had been given the mandate to intervene, it would have broken the back of the Interahamwe. So sort of very quick, incisive form, but very much the focus on capacity building, developing the local capabilities of resilience and dealing with the conflict as part of a political process. The second, and very much in line with Ambassador Abdullah, who was very diplomatic in the way he raised it, but there is a definite challenge in finding consensus in the UN in New York. And so in whatever is done, there needs to be an attempt to bring together the different forces, even within the Secretariat, and agree on an overall approach. And that then has to include the whole of the UN system. And again, so that was sort of the second. And then the third, which again, Jeff presented and others sort of discussed, is the need to try and think through the mandate and the approach before actually raising it in the Security Council. That the reflection on the type of intervention has to be worked out before bringing it up to the Security Council, because the Security Council has its own dynamics, and the dynamics right now are probably much less enabling than they were before. So those are sort of the themes that at least I understood from this discussion.
Thank you so much, Charles. And I realize I have 2 points just. And one is, of course, thank you, Colonel Gil, Roberto Gil, Alcobas. It's, of course, in Uruguay now. And, of course, also being the host of the IAPTC, which they very successfully did just a couple of weeks ago, which I was really happy to and enjoyed participating virtually. So excellent. Congratulations on that. And thank you for coming to join our conversation here. And therefore, those of you who knows me know that we normally start on time and finish on time. But every 25 years, which is our anniversary, I would like still to invite each panelist, if you have 1 minute, to just some concluding reflections. And if you have to leave, whether you're a participant or panelist, we fully understand. But we just need to wrap this up because it's been really, really thoughtful and it's a beginning of a session. So with that, I will invite the police advisor. Louis, if you have 1 minute. Some concluding reflection.
No, very quickly, the first point is that if you will invite me, I will be here 25 years from now. So it will be a good sign that I will be alive and that the GCSP will also be alive. Second, that of course, to say that I was delighted to listen. All the panelists, very rich, and in the action of the police division will continue to be driven by, of course, your comments, but above all, by the member states. The member states are the big boss of the United Nations Police. And then finally, I believe that in the times of pandemic that we are living, I would like to wish that soon we will have the vaccine for everyone, that soon we will pass this phase. And in terms of lessons learned, that we all together will learn, and particularly the ones that have the authority to decide, that we can only pass the crisis together with the comparative advantage with everyone, where the police, of course, will play a key role in the service of the communities that we serve. Thank you very much, Annika.
Thank you very much. Excellent. Thank you. Victoria.
Thanks very much. I'll repeat something I said before, which is that analyzing the political dynamics is core. And there's a lot of ways to analyze dynamics that are being brought together within the UN, and that should be emphasized. And part of that is also human rights. It's in the chat. It gets to Robert's point about legitimacy. We haven't spoken enough about that. That is not an option. The UN needs to stand for human rights. It's a people-centered organization, even as it's a body of member states. So briefly from that, if you get a good analysis, the architecture should follow. And there's some problems in plain sight that member states often miss. So I also want to say we should hear the voices of the UN itself at all levels. I myself have been in meetings. I'll turn to the expert on country Y and say, what do you think? And some will go on and others will pause because they don't always feel empowered. And I think the UN should fully feel empowered to tell member states what they see and what they need to hear. And then from that, we build the architecture, the political strategy, and we think innovatively about the future. And thank you again for this great discussion.
Thank you very much, Tori. Excellent. Very good. And now we have Jeff. And I should also say, sorry, thank you also for putting in the link to the research that you're doing. So those of you, please check the chat for the link that Tori provided. Jeff.
Thanks, and thanks for a great discussion. It was wonderful to hear the various interventions. I'd like to respond to something in the chat. One of the wise people in the chat says something about, why are we talking about peacekeeping? Why aren't we talking about peace operations? And there's really two reasons, and they're both rather bureaucratic and stupid. But the two reasons are, first of all, peace operations inside the UN bureaucracy has become a shorthand for a battle between what used to be DPA and what used to be DPKO, now DPPA and DPO, where the two sides are looking at each other with suspicion about who's trying to take whose missions to have responsibility. This shouldn't happen given the reform from the fact that the operational teams are together. It's still there though, we have to admit it. So there's a competitive element inside the Secretariat over the term peace operations and what does that mean for where these missions end up bureaucratically. But the more important, that one's just stupid, bureaucratic. The more important one is member states themselves. Member states themselves have not embraced this term. They intentionally didn't embrace the term after the HIPPO report was submitted in 2015. And this has to do with budget reasons, that the two types of missions are funded differently, and the member states have made the decision to keep those funding streams separate. And so that we can use peace operations as shorthand to encompass the entire range of flexible mechanisms that the UN has to offer. But when it comes down to where do they fall funding-wise, they're still separate. SPMs and peacekeeping operations are still separate because of member state decisions.
All right, thank you so much. Thank you so much. Now I have Robert. Can you please unmute yourself?
Yeah, you're
Yeah, I held back there for several seconds, actually.
Yes, to pick up Jeff's point, because I think perhaps I didn't make it clear enough, I would see peacekeeping as part of the set of the UN family's contribution to peace operations. And my concern, I think all our concern is peacekeeping has become very large and unwieldy and tries to do lots of things, too many things with too many mandates, which actually needs to be refocused back on what peacekeeping can do, short, sharp, and if necessary, with competent forces. My last point is, I don't think we should have zero-sum discussions about police and military. Because we all have constraints. The police have constraints. They could never have 90% of uniform presence would be police in an operation because we don't have that capacity nationally to do that. But police and military working together as appropriate to build a security sector of member states is very, very important. And I think what's happening in Secretariat now is that is clearly understood and we're moving in that direction. I'd like to see, as I said, though, a little bit more doctrinal focus on the new role of peacekeeping within broader peace operations. Thank you.
Wonderful. Looking forward to that doctrine and following up on the short, sharp, and with force. That's the cue for Richard.
Yeah, I would simply pick up on Charles's third point, where Charles agreed with Jeff that a lot of the work of imagining peace operations has to take place away from the Security Council and perhaps even away from, at times, UN headquarters, given the tensions that Jeff just laid out. Jeff referred to the way that the Colombian political mission was brought sort of pre-cooked to the Security Council. I remember sitting in a cafe in Brooklyn 7 years ago, writing an input paper for the Norwegian mediators on what a mission in Colombia would look like. So it started in Brooklyn and we took it to Manhattan via Bogota. But I think there's an important lesson there, which is, the UN is still carrying a huge number of operational burdens. It is fighting with very significant political headwinds. It is hugely important that organizations like GCSP are out there throwing out new ideas, thinking about the future, and feeding into this process, because I think a lot of what you do still gives the impetus for change that can't always come from within the system. So I think this is a great project.
Thank you very much, Richard, and thank you very much, everyone, the distinguished panelists for taking the time, and the participants also very much for joining us, and we will be following up on the things raised in the chat. We very much look forward to that. And thank you so much, everyone, for joining us for our 25th anniversary. But of course, the key issues, the focus is the importance of the topic of strengthening peace operations so that we can better support and hopefully protect people that are caught up in violent conflict. So thank you everyone for joining, and allow me also to thank our coordinator for this event, Thierry Randon, who you will have seen on the screen throughout, who's been taking care of making everything happen. And actually, like the African Union motto, let peace happen, and let us continue the conversation. We very much appreciate the beginning, and thank you all for participating.